And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Tonight we have three really special gentlemen on this call. Bob Fanning, who has been on our program before, as well as Charles Ortel. Charles has been on our show several times as well. And Dr. William K. Black. Dr. Black is not on the call yet, but he is supposed to be on shortly. And I just want to thank these gentlemen for coming on to the program tonight, because we have a very, very important discussion that the American public needs to hear. And that discussion is about the financial system, the meltdown in 2008, a lot of the stuff that happened that precipitated that event, and then talk about what has been done about that, if anything. Frankly, a lot of it has not improved the situation, and to talk about what President-elect or President Trump can do to change that, and what we need to do to shut down the systems that are intent in destroying our financial system in this country. I think a lot of us recognize that what's been going on over the last 20 or 30 years is not the America that we grew up in. It's not the America that we understand, and high finance has always been a subject that, although most of us should understand very clearly, we don't. And we don't because our school systems don't teach it, and people don't discuss it in the way that we're going to talk to our audience tonight. And one of the caveats of this discussion, Bob Fanning and I talked about that earlier, is that we will make this a program that average Americans can listen to and understand and do something about it. So with that said, I would like to introduce our guests individually. Bob, would you please come on and talk to our audience and explain some of your background and explain to us what you are trying to do with this call tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, Dan, and it's an honor, as it has been on 4 or 5 past occasions. I was registered as a representative of the New York Stock Exchange and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission in 1974, and I became a member of the Chicago Board of Trade and started trading for myself and for institutional customers in the Treasury bond pit, because my specialty is fixed income bonds. I got to know Charles Ortel back in 2014, October 7th, 2014. We had dinner at Sidecar in New York with R. Christopher Whalen, and the umbrella of discussion was systemic risk for the average American. That is, what is the risk posed to the system by the dealings of the Federal Reserve or the too-big-to-fail banks or companies like Fannie Mae? And we had a good talk about derivatives and the risk of counterparty failure. And I think that's enough of a introduction of me. You've got a real superstar in Charles Ortel. He's the man who did the forensic accounting of the Clinton Foundation. So I'll let him introduce himself.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's Charles here. I'll just be brief. I worked in investment banking and in professional investing from 1980 through 2002 when I retired at the age of 46, and then took some time off to gain custody of my kids, raise them, and got back into the business and media world, predicting the credit crisis, and specifically that a large, complex company everyone thought was safe, that is General Electric, was actually a bank in drag, and a bad bank at that. And I did that in 2007, before the crisis, and that has led me into the business of identifying complex frauds, bringing them to the attention of the public, and also, in more recent years, suggesting ways that the system might actually be fixed, because I think while America has its flaws, many of them, it also has great strengths. And we are already in a downdraft period. It's going to get worse. But at the end of the day, this country will end up being far stronger than any other advanced economy. And we need to give what help we can to Donald Trump and his incoming team to motivate the general public to bring these corrupt, gigantic government bureaucracies, put them on a diet, cut out the waste, reconfigure them to the 21st century, put them under the citizens' control, and introduce the rigors that we feel in the private sector to the public sector. So I'm delighted to be joining this call with you, august men, and I hope that we have some fun with your audience.
We're going to have some fun.
Well, thank you, Charles. And I have to say that I've been looking forward to this call because economics is an area that I'm always very interested in, and I was especially interested in the collapse in 2008. And Bob's aware of this, but I, like you, saw it coming and predicted it to my kids and to my friends, and wrote quite a lengthy letter explaining what was going on and why. And really, so much of the system was based on the derivatives, on the so-called complex financial instruments, which really weren't all that complex. They were extremely complex. But the bottom line was a lot of them were just casino gambling, called financial instruments. And Bob, I'd like you to maybe lead in and with Charles and talk about how the unregulated derivatives market has turned into the not only the camel's nose under the tent, but the camel now is inside the tent, and there's no room for anyone else.
That's exactly right. To the tune of 1.25 quadrillion. That's 1,000 billion. That's 1,200 billion. I'm from the listed futures and options market at the Chicago Board of Trade. That has been developing since the 1600s. The Chicago Board of Trade opened its doors in 1842, and everything went just fine until Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and the International Swaps Dealers Association decided to do unregulated, unmargined, not marked to the market, opaque derivatives. They're complex contracts. They're private treaty contracts that Wall Street engineered. And the reason they engineered them is because they were able to do principal commissions as opposed to agency commissions. Everybody knows what an agency commission is. It's you buy 100 shares of General Motors or General Electric, the commission is stated $100 or whatever you've negotiated. In the OTC, over-the-counter market, these commissions are buried, and they're buried from very sophisticated investors. The bond funds or the stock funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, all the big institutional investors, including central banks, were dealing in these OTC, over-the-counter, unregulated derivatives. And the reason they had such a feeding frenzy on these derivatives before the Greenspan put, which was a pump and dump of our financial system, the fact of the matter is that this was all about commissions. Goldman Sachs was able to get toxic securitizations once they got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, and they were able to bury huge commissions in the collateralized debt obligations. They also buried huge commissions, yield to maturity on collateralized or credit default swaps. The credit default swaps and the collateralized debt obligations were a package that ultimately the taxpayer had to step up and bail out these fraudulent gaming instruments. They weren't hedges, they were fraudulent gaming instruments. And the reason I invited Dr. Black to show is Dr. Black, who is the #1 white-collar crimes expert in America. The reason I invited him is he stated for the record, for the permanent record, that the reason that we had a financial collapse in 2008 is because the Federal Reserve Board refused to enforce their own anti-fraud provisions. And that's what I've been dreaming of in terms of having this show, so we can educate the public into knowing that these products, this entire system, has to be regulated. And I believe that Mr. Trump can add to his own powers as President of the United States by overseeing the anti-fraud regulator at the Federal Reserve Board. I've talked too long. Go ahead, Charles.
No, I think in addition to what, Bob, you so astutely point out, what's happened in the period 1980 to 2008 is the system that all of us who've been involved in business know in our daily lives. In the private sector, where you get a paycheck, let's say you get a paycheck every week, which most people don't these days, but let's say you did. You know you're winning if at the end of the week you have money left over. You have earned money, but you spent less money than you've earned, so you can save. That's how you get rich, spending less money than you earn and investing it wisely. In the period 1980 to, I would say, 97, it was possible to spend less money than you earned and find investments that made sense, investments in the public securities markets, common stocks of companies whose revenues were increasing, not because they were doing crazy acquisitions and restructurings, but because they designed new products and services, they were selling more of them, they were able to keep their prices firm, they were able to control their costs, they were able to invest in capital expenditures wisely, and they were generating what is called free cash flow, the same that you see in a household making a paycheck every week. The money left over at the end of the week, that's free cash flow. You were seeing companies fairly valued on their growth prospects, on their profit margins, on their generation of free cash flow, up until about 1997, when the bubble began to inflate, the bubble of a high-tech speculative bubble. We all know how that burst in 2000, 2001. In the period 2001 through the credit crisis, the advent of the credit crisis in 2008, you stopped seeing the types of growth that I've been talking about, the important top-line growth, more customers, more products, from results that are not fake. You stopped seeing. You saw flat growth. You saw profit margins eroding, and to offset these negatives, what our regulators got together and did, the central banks and others, was to begin artificially suppressing interest rates even more than they had been in the past. That inflated a bubble. We know what happened with the crisis. On December 31st, 2008, we stepped through the looking glass into a new world of financial insanity, where to make it seem as if a recovery had actually occurred, the central banks went even further, and they pushed interest rates below the rate of inflation to a very dangerous place. Central banks used to be the rigorous disciplinarians in countries who would not let speculators go into crazy land. But no, at the end of December 2008, we entered purgatory, financial purgatory. We're not in hell, we're not in heaven, we're in no man's land waiting to figure out which way we're supposed to go. And to make everything look good, the large economies in the world, I believe, encouraged their central banks to get even more reckless and then compounded the felony by running massive deficits. So we're now in a place, simply put, where the households in America, even those that think they have no debt, actually have a lot more debt, because we, in the end, it's been proven, are responsible for the irresponsible actions of our governments, of our banks, of our businesses. When the crunch time comes, we hear, well, we got to bail this out, or we got to fix this, or we got to raise taxes. So when you look at our economy, the way I do, we have too much total debt on incomes that are declining in real terms, and we face this existential threat for many people in this economy of machines taking over the current and next generation's work. Even people who think they're immune are now far more vulnerable to being replaced by machines and technology than they once were. So that's all negative stuff. What's the good news? The good news is that as bad as that situation is here in the United States, it's far worse in Europe. It's far worse in Japan. It's far worse, obviously, in the countries that were developing and growing, like Brazil's blowing up, South Africa's blowing up, India's in trouble, China's in trouble, Russia, of course, is under sanction. So when all of it, as Bob rightly says, when the mayhem mounts further, there will be more of a bid for U.S. government securities. There'll be a flight to safety. Interest rates will go down here. But we face, I think, a stock market reckoning that's going to be worse than 1987. It's going to be worse than 1929. For those who know the history, it'll be more like 1873. It's going to be a major downdraft, and we need to prepare for it.
I was on the trading floor in 1987, and the crash of 1987 was scary. People were worried about people jumping out of windows. That's real world. And the sins of 1987 were exacerbated by writing premium on puts. And when you write premium on puts and things, selling premium means that you think the market's going to continue to go up. In the case of puts, naked premiums being sold ultimately means infinity for losses if you're wrong, which was what happened in 1987. The same example can be extrapolated into the 2008 crash, where naked premium was once again written, but in that case, it was credit default swaps written primarily by Citibank and AIG. We have not learned from that lesson, where the financial economy, where the paper pushers of the world got away with capturing our government and our Federal Reserve, and were able to push these frauds off on the American public. Catherine Austin Fitts, who Charles worked with at Dillon Reed, quantified the offshoring of $23 trillion worth of jobs, only to be followed by the theft of everybody's home equity in real estate, because Wall Street was able to play these games with these toxic instruments. I think that Mr. Trump had better be the new cop on the block, especially if we're going to repatriate the taxes that were generated offshore by offshoring these 23 trillion in jobs. This is a chance for America to be given restitution for the frauds that have taken place with outsourcing and the Greenspan put of 2008. And I'm very concerned that the repatriation of $1.77 trillion that's sitting offshore will get into the filthy hands of the financial economy, the paper flippers, instead of going to the real economy, instead of going to Main Street. And I think that Mr. Trump, it behooves him to put his own regulator, anti-fraud regulator, on right at the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Bob, well, I'm gonna kind of get this conversation back to a real common understanding. In 2008, we saw the collapse of the real estate market, and we saw the collapse of the what we will call, and it is called, the derivatives market, but it was basically people were getting liar loans. They were buying houses that they couldn't afford. They were not being properly screened as far as income or anything else because the interest rates were so artificially low that they were allowing people to buy basically more house than they could afford. And in 2008, when all this started to come apart, and incidentally, if people haven't seen this movie, they should go see a movie that is called what the heck is it? The Big
Short.
The Big Short. The Big Short. And that movie was about how the derivatives market and how the gambling worked. But in any case,
Dan, I don't mean to talk over you, but do you know who else recommended that movie? Donald Trump.
Oh, really? Well,
yes,
that's
sir.
wonderful because the man really has good insight. I know you and I talked about it when it first came out. I saw it literally the week that it came out. I went to it, and it was amazing because it talked about things that no one else had talked about other than people like yourself and like Charles. But the bottom line, anyway, is when we bailed out, supposedly bailed out the banks for, the problems with the banking institutions in September 2008, we were told first that the House of Representatives were given the ultimatum that they needed to bail out the banks to the tune of roughly $750 billion, and the Congress, the House, refused to do it. So within a day, they were moving. The Senate was given the same ultimatum, although the Senate is not authorized by our Constitution to initiate funding measures of any kind. The Senate was given that same proposal, only it was sweetened until the dollar amount was $853 billion, and for some reason the Senate said, yeah, we'll do it. And they moved to allow this bailout by the taxpayers. Well, the bottom line is that was only the tip of the iceberg, and by the time the international banks, all the banks all over the world and everywhere else were given money by the Fed, the dollar amount is, well, I've heard various numbers, but I've heard pretty solid numbers in excess of $15 trillion. And the taxpayers don't know that. They thought they bailed out $853 billion, and in fact, we were bailing out banks in derivatives markets all over the world because the whole system was so closely tied together. So that is kind of a background on this. And Charles, you really understand this process well. Would you talk about how that whole thing came about?
Sure. So one of the biggest asset categories in the United States and really in the global economy, but in the United States in particular, are mortgage loans and against personal homes and against, to a lesser extent, office buildings and industrial properties. So there's this gigantic need for mortgages. And for a long time period, I remember one of the reasons I got concerned was I started hearing from many different people the same argument that the aggregate value of residential real estate in the United States has never gone down since 1945. I remember hearing decades ago, a similar argument about Japan. When I heard that at first, my hackles, the hair on the back of my back went, standing straight up. What the banks were doing, they didn't care about underlying valuation of their collateral. They had engineered a way to make money basically between the time somebody applied for the loan and closing. The interest rates would drop, the baked-in profit for them would rise on their underlying collateralized mortgage loans. And so they were very happy in this world where they felt collateral values of the houses was only going to go up, interest rates were only going to go down. It became a world of ever higher leverage where banks weren't putting up 100 cents on the dollar for the mortgage loan. No, they were leveraged to the hilt. And, of course, it went to speculative excess. And the amazing thing, and we all know about the bust, we all know what's happened, no one seems to have learned much. And now herein lies the opportunity. I am not a fan of Elizabeth Warren for many reasons, nor am I particularly a fan of Bernie Sanders for other reasons. But I actually think we're at this unusual moment in American history where people, and there are some good-meaning people on the left, and people on the right who believe that it's been an unfair game for the big banks, the too big to fail banks, as Bob calls them, where their compensation is so much higher for their employees. Forget about the top guys. Middle-level people at banks make far more than middle-level executives. And these banks went to speculative excess, cost, as Bob said, $15 trillion in the 2007 to 9 time frame. Now we're heading for another shellacking. And I think it's time to admit that the regulatory monstrosity created partially because of the Bush problems, but principally during the Obama years, is a monstrosity that's never going to work effectively, and that these very big banks need to get broken up responsibly. I think Elizabeth Warren is right for the wrong reasons. She's right when she says that there's a world of traditional banks, the ones I was talking about earlier, where you take that money, that extra money that's left over at the end of a week, and you go get in your car or you walk out your front door and you go to your local bank and you ask your banker, is there a place I can tie this money up where I might get a rate of return higher than inflation, so that when I take it out of your bank, it's worth at least what I put in, arguably a bit more. We were in that world from 1980 to 1997. You could make a rate of return at a bank and taking relatively low risk where you weren't eaten away by inflation and taxes. But we haven't been in that world since 2008. And in part, and so these very large banks, they're massive. They're so massive that I would venture to say that their CEOs and boards don't really understand what the bank is actually doing at a given moment. They're too big. They're not deriving
casinos.
Yeah, they're not deriving any real competitive advantages. And particularly in the mortgage market, when you have people making credit decisions without understanding what the underlying situation is in a given community, you're in trouble. It's never going to work well. So we need to go through, I think, some restructuring, some profound restructuring, not simply of the banks, but also of the accounting firms, these large accounting firms that write opinions that don't mean anything. They don't ever really go, some do. Arthur Andersen's no longer with us, but in recent years we haven't seen any retribution against many of these large accounting firms that have written, in quotes, audits that are not worth the paper they're printed on. We have, I think, a concentration of power in these big law firms, and that's dangerous because the regulators, instead of doing their job and feeling that they can have a professional existence as regulators, it's readily seduced after a number of years to jump into the law firms that are defending the people they used to be regulating. So you get regulation light or no regulation at all. Then, in addition, I'm not really a fan of big government or of massive bureaucracies, but having been at this since 2007-8, I think that we have a false sense, the general public has a false sense that the regulatory apparatus is equipped to regulate these complex multinational companies and now charities like the Clinton Foundation. We don't have in this country yet the ability to do that. The SEC, the Federal Reserve is certainly not doing a good job, and the FDA, even in the drug area, the IRS, they don't have the ability to really understand what's going on in these very large companies that operate all over the place using derivatives and other complex means. And the further problem is that these very large companies tend to be companies that are big advertisers, big contributors to political campaigns. So when the time comes to go after the big companies for their excesses, these big companies can go down a long list of names in the House and the Senate and in various state legislatures and capitals and countries around the world where they have friends who are willing to look the other way. So Donald Trump is absolutely right. I think he touched across the aisle during his monumental success in 2016. But I'm a bit concerned that he's not moving fast enough against the IRS, fast enough on some of these economic issues, and I'm a bit concerned that we in the wider world here aren't doing enough to motivate the swamp to understand that they're not going to pull a fast one between now and 2018. There will be more retribution against the swamp if we don't get the government under control, the tax system redone, the spending constrained, and our politicians held accountable and the donors held accountable for their speculative excesses that are being paid by the mothers and fathers, the grandmothers and grandfathers, and on our children and grandchildren's backs. It's just not right to do that. To let Wall Street and the swamp in Washington, D.C. Continue running the biggest unregulated casino on earth.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
The Chinese
Charles and Bob, we're going to take a very quick short break here, and then we'll come back. I'd like to discuss what Glass-Steagall, the importance of reinstating the Glass-Steagall, at least the intent of that law. But Kelby, I turn the show over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you guys coming on these calls week in and week out. Please visit republicfortheunitedstates.org. You will notice that we have a series of postings for the last 8 years, from radio shows to phone calls. We encourage you to look at the Wednesday Building the States phone call. This is where we educate people on how to re-inhabit on a state-by-state, county-by-county, municipality by municipality, bringing it from the corporate to the de jure environment that we had pre-1850. We do have these calls, the Dan Hampel Show, week in and week out, every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific. We look forward to seeing you week in and week out, and we look forward to your support. So please invite your friends to come and learn the truth, as Dan so aptly does with his guests. Dan, I yield the floor to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Kelby. Bob and Charles, I know that this has always been a real tipping point for the economy, has been the fact that in 1999, the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been in place since 1930-31, that really did not allow banks to cross the boundaries of being an investment bank, insurance companies, and get into all these complex financial instruments. Banks up until that point were required to be banks. There were commercial banks, there were state banks, there were regulated banks. And with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, they could get into virtually anything they wanted. Would you, I guess, Bob, would you like to talk about that and explain how that happened?
Our banks turned into casinos thanks to the 106th Congress, who planted the 4 satchel charges that blew up our American economy. Number one, the Community Reinvestment Act, which expanded Fannie Mae's balance sheet between 1993 and 2001. Number two, the continued deregulation of credit default swaps, which are instruments that blew up the economy. Number three, as speaking to your point, Dan, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which ultimately turned our banks into securitization mills, which blew up the economy. The Glass-Steagall Act prohibited banks from acting as security originators. They couldn't act as an investment bank, like Charles is an investment banker. But when that wall came down, the banks took that opportunity to bundle up all of their garbage loans, their toxic securitizations, and dump them around the world. And it also gave them the courage to make really bad loans. And the remedy for this is to reinstate Glass-Steagall and prohibit our banks from becoming hedge funds, from becoming gamblers. And we have a problem. We have a problem sitting right next to Mr. Trump. In the Chinese communist world, you have a minder that follows you around to make sure that you don't do anything that would hurt the system. Our minder, the minder who's been put in place by the paper pushers in the financial economies, affectionately known as banksters, is Mr. Mnuchin, who's there to do the bidding of the International Swaps Dealers Association, the too big to fail banks, Goldman Sachs, and J.P. Morgan. So we have him that's got Mr. Trump's ear. What we need is a regulator who will sit in mind, watch the Federal Reserve Board, and report back to Mr. Trump on a quarterly basis that the banksters are not using fraud as a business model, as they did in 2008. Why am I really concerned? Really, really concerned? Not only because Mr. Mnuchin is in place as a minder for Wall Street, but we've now just hired Mr. Steve Kalk from Chicago Bank Corp, who was an originator of toxic securities. He's on Mr. Trump's economic advisory team. If you're going to have Kalk, you have to have somebody offsetting him, representing that the system is not awash in fraud anymore, because it was Mr. Kalk's fraudulent securities that took securities like his that took down the system. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I'd like to get Charles' take on this. You've I'm sure you have an opinion about all this. Charles, tell us what you think.
Of course, I grew up in a very small investment bank that really, we had a trading operation, but it was tiny. And the discipline in the old days, in true investment banks, we had what was actually called the buying department. The buying department was a group of people, that I was one of them, where you would decide, should our bank want to buy the securities that we then were going to sell to the market? Do we like the idea of buying this common stock of a client or this debt? And then we had the selling department, the marketing department. And in my firm, once you got to be a partner, you had to you ate last. If there was a problem in the bank, you had to cough up your personal money to solve the problem of let's say, a mismatch that Bob was talking about in 2007, 8, 9 timeframe. We would have had to come up with personal money. And beyond that, all of our securities had to be held in accounts in our firm, which weren't insured, because most of us had more money than the insurance maximum. So, that you had a different attitude when you were playing with your own money. And then with the changes that Bob was talking about, another change was that suddenly these firms in the great trading world could start playing with retail money. They could go public, and they could get investors to basically give them more capital to put into this unregulated gigantic casino. So there's a lack of balance in the system, occasioned by the factors that Bob has been talking about. And this Glass-Steagall thing, was a very bad idea, eliminating the division. The people who went through the great crash and thought about what were the reasons that contributed to the great crash, one of them was this leveraged speculative excess. Of course, there were no real regulations back in that point in time, but there were lots of speculative leveraged pools that were driving the prices of securities into the stratosphere beyond reason. So a decision was made that those two activities should be kept separate. And they were for almost, 70 years or so, 75 years. And so it's time, really, to go back over this ground and reconstitute a system where it's possible for the bottom 80% of this country. You know that the statistics show that the bottom 80% of American households, that's about 100 million households, have no financial wealth of any kind. Why should they? You look around, what does it seem sensible to buy? To put your money in a CD, certificate of deposit at a bank that's highly leveraged, where you're going to earn less than the rate of inflation? That doesn't make sense. You look at the individual common stocks that you could buy, they all seem to be, most of them trading at very high levels. We don't have a financial reality today that makes sense for the overwhelming majority of our household, and that's wrong. So this bubble needs to be corrected, and in the aftermath of the correction that is, I think, in process, and may actually come very suddenly, we need to go back to a bit of the old world, and then have the benefit of, there are benefits that have come from technology, and make the financial arena, make the system of benefits and risks more sensibly aligned, so that we don't march again into another crazy bubble, and we hold the people responsible. I mean, the politicians can yell and scream all they want. What have they done since October of 2008 except drop a whole bunch of debt on our backs, allow in the deficits and the fake stimulus that created very few, if any, new jobs, a lot of money to pass into cronies' hands? We need to go back over this ground, understand who is responsible for all this, who benefited from all this, who got the no-bid contracts, what donors, what political donors in both parties gamed the system. We need to expose all that and take some of the great ideas on the right and the left and bring the system truly into 2017 instead of pretending that it's working.
Well,
and I would agree with that, Charles. And one thing that I would say, though, is that I think our elected officials have really abrogated their responsibility since 1913, when they allowed the Federal Reserve to literally take over the financial system of the country. Now, I recognize there are people on both sides of that issue, whether or not we could exist under a totally treasury centered system on that's backed by gold and silver. I think certainly we could, but at the same time, I know there are a lot of people with differing opinions on that. But the one common constant there is that government allowed private banks to take over our entire financial system, and they walked away from their responsibility. And I think it's really important that our leaders are responsible for our economy, because without our economy functioning correctly, then we've got nothing in our country. Won't survive without a strong economy. Bob, did you want to say something to that?
Yes, and you brought up the movie The Big Short. We know for The Big Short, the Greenspan put, no one was ever punished. Why should they be punished? They had an undue influence. They were They were able to get government to do whatever they wanted the government to do, as evidenced by the public broadcasting show Frontline, which brought to your attention the fact that the system is corrupt. And we learned in The Big Short that there is a cost, not only financial cost of putting 10 million people out of their homes, destroying 14 million jobs, destroying the small businessman's capital in order to create jobs, but there was a cost, and I'm here to say exactly what was said in The Big Short. For every 1% that the unemployment rate went up in response to The Big Short, 40,000 people died. So what I'm here to represent is the people that have Mr. Mnuchin next to Mr. Trump are guilty of genocide. And I think that's a strong enough word to bring in a financial regulator to make sure that the system is the fraud is completely moved out of the system. And as long as these companies control Congress and the president, nothing will ever change. They'll continue to look at middle-class America, 330 million people, as sheep to be sheared and their property to be stolen. So we need some help here, Mr. Trump, especially if you're going to bring $1.77 trillion back on shore. Give it a Main Street, build that infrastructure, and keep the financial economy's filthy mitts off of the $1.77 trillion. That's what I've got to say.
Well, the movie The Big Short really had great information in it, and Charles, your reference to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, I have to agree with you. Even a blind squirrel once in a while can find a nut, and that certainly is the case with both of those folks in recognizing that there was a tremendous amount of fraud in our big banking relationship, our financial relationship with government. And I think Elizabeth Warren was in a movie called In Debt We Trust that, she made an awful lot of sense in that movie about the amount of manipulation and what it was doing to our economy. And that was in 2007, that movie came out. And then another movie, Inside Job, came out in about 2010 or so, that discussed how all this stuff came together. And, the bottom line is that the manipulation of the system has to end, and the only way that that's going to happen is if government, and this I really do believe in, government needs to get involved in regulating against fraud. Charles, can you address that?
Sure. I would say that there's a set of structural issues that need to be addressed to right-size the American economy and put us in a place where we will suffer least and ultimately prosper most against the other large economies that are competing with us around the world. So there's some structural steps that need to take place. I actually address these in great detail on my site, charlesortel.com. There's a 10-point plan that goes into great detail in how structurally we could fix this. As to fraud, the sad reality is, unfortunately, that for as long as they're human beings, there's going to be fraud. People are born fraudsters. There's a community of them. They delight in carrying out fraud, and whatever system of rules we come up with, the fraudster will try to break those rules. But you're right to point out that we don't have enough incentives in place for people to stand up when they see fraud, face down the truly powerful, who frequently overlook the fraud because it's too embarrassing to them. And when you do that, the fraud gets bigger and bigger. and empower these people. And of course, I'm asking, for in some ways for help for myself, because that's what I do. But generally, we need to make it a good thing that Americans stand up and say something and do something when they see fraud. And unfortunately, when you look around at our economy, I would argue that one of the biggest frauds being perpetrated on the American public right now is the sale of U.S. government debt. I mean, we have U.S. government debt interest rates have been manipulated downwards to levels that make no sense. And you really have to be kind of foolish today to buy long-term 30-year U.S. government debt at whatever rate it's being priced at in the current market. If people don't believe there isn't going to be massive inflationary upward pressure on prices, they're missing, they're not doing their reading, and they don't understand the current movie. They don't understand reality. So absolutely, I think more people need to, when they see fraud, they need to stand up, they need to be counted. My latest effort in that regard is on the Clinton so-called charity, in quotes, network that they've created. There are a lot of charities out there that are rogue charities. They pretend they're doing good work. In reality, they're diverting money from desperately needy people into the hands of the people who run the charities, their friends, their associates. They're stealing money from the poor. They're playing Robin Hood in reverse. And the Clinton Foundation is one sad example of that, but it's not the only one. So it would be great if your audience could really stand up and be counted and lend their voices to try to induce Mr. Trump, who for some strange reason still has in place the leader of the IRS, the same person who was almost impeached last year, is in place running this crazy IRS that is, very few people can understand the forms and rules that the IRS promulgates, and that's for good reason. You create a system that's so complicated no one really understands it, then you get your cronies in running it, and you can let your friends off, you can persecute your enemies, you give bureaucrats a tremendous amount of power, you give a political machine a tremendous amount of power. That needs to go away in the form of a simplified and then flat tax system. It's the same for rich and poor alike. That's one of the elements of my 10-point plan. So thank you for letting me talk about this. I think it's really great what you guys are doing, and it's nice to raise awareness. The mass of humanity in America lives honest, decent lives. They save, they spend less money than they earn. They take the balance, they contribute it to charity, they save it, they take care of their families, their communities, their neighbors. And they will be shocked when they understand, yet again, after this craziness in 2007 through 2009, we have learned nothing in the swamp, nothing in Manhattan, nothing in Washington, D.C. The game rolls on.
That's well said. That's well said. I have to say, too, I know that we've actually, the average income of the average American has actually gone down over the last 17 years, and we're at a lower level right now than we were in 1998. So, Bob, did you want to, we're getting close to the time, the end of the show. Would you like to yes, kind of wrap up with your ideas about what we need to do?
The American saver has been punished. His CD rates are near zero. The same thing with Treasury securities. That's an accommodation that was made in the LIBOR market for the derivatives dealers. Derivatives dealers pay nothing to carry a 1.25 quadrillion in derivatives. The American saver has been punished, and eventually he'll give up on saving. So I believe that we had better affect some policies at the Federal Reserve that are in favor of Main Street, the saver, the people who will show their industry and their ambition. And at this juncture, the saver is being punished right at the Federal Reserve in deference to the International Swaps Dealers Association, J.P. Morgan, and Goldman Sachs, so they can carry these derivatives books at no cost to themselves, but at great cost to the American saver. So that's what I've got to say about that.
Okay, well, you're absolutely right on that. I mean, we've been at a virtually 0% interest now for the last 9 years, and with that low interest rate, it supposedly was going to kick the economy into gear and make things grow, but we are artificially holding the interest rate so low that the savers, the retired people, the people that used to invest in this country are the ones that are really suffering from this. So, Charles and Bob, Charles, would you like to talk about some of the projects you're working on, and then some of your sites, so that our listeners can look at some of the information that you've got available?
Well, thank you. I'll be quick. The best way to follow what I'm doing is to follow me on Twitter, and I'm at Charles Ortel, O-R-T-E-L, on Twitter. To find out some of my more detailed exhibits, I've mentioned my site. My current focus at the moment is the Clinton Foundation and their many allied charities, exposing the fraud, the ongoing unprosecuted fraud there, bringing it to the attention of the state's attorney general, to regulators around the world. I've got teams of people on this. We're making slow, steady progress. We're waiting for John Koskinen, the head of the IRS, to be replaced. And we're wishing Donald Trump and his team success stopping this attempted coup d'etat, which seems to be in process here.
Yeah,
Okay,
amen to that.
Bob, would you have anything that you would like to finish up with, and then we're going to turn the show back over to Kelby.
Yes, I'm on my way back to the Chicago Board of Trade to work with my institutional hedge accounts, because I believe that the $1.7 trillion that is going to be infused into our economy and create the infrastructure boom will ultimately help to lift interest rates, raise interest rates. So we're going to be hedging bond prices against a ultimately falling apart. So that's where I'm headed, and I wish Mr. Trump all the successes in the world in his fight against the deep state. And Charles was absolutely correct. Mr. Trump can show that he's in charge by getting rid of the head of the IRS, who has politicized that agency. Thank you.
Well, I agree. And also we need to really take a reexamination of the people that are appointed to some of the highest offices. You referred to Mr. Mnuchin, the new Treasury Secretary. We need to make sure that whoever we have in those positions are people that truly represent the citizens of the United States, and not more of the same, because more of the same is going to destroy this country. We can't continue to do that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that will be the end of our show, and we invite you to come back again next week. We will have new guests to help our listeners to connect the dots. And with that, Kelby, we turn the show over to you.
Thanks, Dan.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.